The gray-haired man slumped in his leather chair, eyes deliberately closed, heart pounding as he waited to see if his decades of wealth had made him a fool for trusting anyone at all. Richard Blackwood hadn't slept properly in 3 years. Not since his daughter's accident. Not since he'd learned that the people he'd trusted most, his business partner, his attorney, his own nephew, had been slowly draining his company's accounts while he grieved. The betrayal had calcified something inside him, turning his heart into a fortress with walls so high that even genuine kindness couldn't scale them anymore. At 72, Richard had everything except faith in humanity. His penthouse office on the 48th floor overlooked Manhattan like a throne room, but lately, it felt more like a prison where he'd sentenced himself to suspicion and solitude. It was a Thursday evening when he decided to run his test. The building had emptied hours ago, and only the cleaning crew remained. Richard sat at his desk, his reading glasses perched on a stack of contracts, his wallet conspicuously placed near the edge, thick with cash, credit cards visible. Anyone could see he was a man of means. Anyone could take advantage. He'd been watching Miguel Santos for weeks. The night janitor worked with his son, a young man who couldn't have been more than 23 or 24. Richard had noticed how the boy, David, he'd heard Miguel call him, always worked with headphones on, pushing his cleaning cart with an odd intensity, as if mopping floors was the most important job in the world. Tonight, Richard would find out what kind of people they really were. He slumped in his chair, letting his head tilt back, mouth slightly open. He slowed his breathing, perfecting the appearance of an old man who'd fallen asleep at his desk after a long day. His wallet sat there like bait. His Rolex caught the dim light. Everything about the scene screamed opportunity. Through his barely open eyelids, Richard watched the door. 20 minutes passed. Then he heard it, the soft squeak of wheels. The cleaning cart. The door opened slowly, and Richard could make out David's silhouette. The young man paused when he saw Richard slumped there. Richard's heart hammered. This was it. This was when he'd confirm what he already knew, that everyone had a price, that kindness was just a mask people wore until opportunity knocked. David stood frozen for a long moment. Then, instead of approaching the desk, he quietly backed out of the room. Richard's eyes opened slightly wider. Was the boy getting his father? Were they going to rob him together? His jaw clenched. But when the door opened again, David was alone. He'd returned without his cleaning cart. In his hands, he carried something small, a blanket. One of those thin ones from the supply closet the janitorial staff used when they took breaks. Richard watched, genuinely confused now, as David approached slowly, carefully. The young man moved with extraordinary gentleness, as if afraid to disturb him. David draped the blanket over Richard's shoulders with the tenderness of a son tucking in an aging parent. But he didn't stop there. David glanced at the wallet, and Richard's muscles tensed. Here it comes, he thought bitterly. Instead, David carefully moved the wallet away from the desk's edge, placing it safely in the center where it couldn't accidentally fall. He did the same with Richard's glasses, setting them in their case. Then the young man noticed the small space heater in the corner of the office. It was November, and the building's heating was unpredictable at night. David quietly turned it on, angling it toward Richard's chair. Richard's carefully controlled breathing hitched almost imperceptibly. David pulled out his phone, and Richard braced himself. Was he taking pictures? Calling someone? But the young man simply typed something, glanced at Richard once more with genuine concern in his dark eyes, and then left the room, closing the door with barely a whisper. Richard sat there, the blanket around his shoulders, the heater humming warmth into the cold office. For the first time in 3 years, tears burned behind his closed eyes. He'd expected theft. He'd gotten compassion. He'd expected exploitation. He'd gotten protection. An hour later, Richard finally moved. He stood, the blanket falling from his shoulders, and walked to his desk. His wallet sat exactly where David had placed it, untouched. Every credit card, every dollar, every piece of identification, all there. But there was something else too. A small note, written on the back of a cleaning checklist in careful handwriting. Sir, you should go home and sleep in a real bed. This building gets cold at night. Please take care of yourself. You matter, David. Richard's hand trembled as he held the note. You matter. 3 years of isolation, 3 years of cynicism, 3 years of building walls, and this janitor's son had demolished them with 3 words and an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness. He had to know why. Richard returned the next evening, this time wide awake. He waited until he heard the cleaning cart, then opened his door. David looked up, startled. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry, I can come back." "No," Richard said, his voice rough. "Please, come in. I wanted to talk to you." The young man's confusion was evident, but he entered carefully. Up close, Richard could see the calluses on David's hands, the tiredness around his eyes, the way his work uniform was worn but immaculately clean. "Last night," Richard began, then paused. "Last night, I was awake. I saw what you did." David's eyes widened. "Oh, I'm sorry if I overstepped, sir. I just thought, you looked so tired, and it was cold, and—" "Why?" Richard interrupted. "Why did you do that? Do you know who I am? What I'm worth?" David blinked, clearly confused by the question. "You're a person who fell asleep at work. My dad does that sometimes when he's exhausted. Everyone deserves to be comfortable. Everyone deserves kindness. You could have taken my wallet," Richard pressed. "There was cash, credit cards. You could have stolen from you." David looked genuinely shocked. "Sir, I don't understand. Why would I do that? That's not who I am. That's not who my father raised me to be." Richard sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 72 years. "Tell me about yourself, David. Please." Over the next hour, David's story emerged. He'd graduated with honors in engineering but couldn't afford to finish his master's degree. His mother had died when he was 15, and he'd watched his father work 3 jobs to keep him in school. Now David worked nights cleaning offices and days at a warehouse, saving every penny to eventually return to his studies. He wanted to design sustainable building systems. He wanted to make structures that wouldn't waste energy, that would be kind to the environment. "My dad always says," David explained, his face lighting up despite his exhaustion, "that how you treat people when you have nothing says everything about who you are. And that how you treat people when you have everything says even more. He taught me that work isn't about what you do, it's about who you are while you're doing it." Richard listened, and with every word, something cold inside him began to thaw. The next week, David arrived at the building to find an envelope with his name on it at the security desk. Inside was a letter from Richard Blackwood offering to fund his master's degree in full, with one condition: that David would work for Richard's company afterward, leading a new sustainable development division Richard was creating. But there was more. Richard had also set up a retirement fund for Miguel, David's father, with enough money to ensure he'd never have to work 3 jobs again. When David called the number on the letter, barely able to speak through his tears, Richard said simply, "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me that my daughter was right, that there's still goodness in this world. That I was wrong to stop looking for it." 6 months later, at the opening of the Blackwood Sustainable Development Center, Richard stood beside David and Miguel, and for the first time in years, he didn't see threats. He saw family. He saw hope. And he'd learned that sometimes the greatest test isn't whether people will disappoint you. It's whether you'll be brave enough to let them prove you wrong.